Awesome. Okay, so we are talking all about digestive health today. I am Brooke Lister. A couple of you, just seeing names I am familiar with on this call, but I am the registered dietitian here at Utah State University. So I work with both students and faculty and staff doing one-on-one consultations. I also typically teach lunch and learns, but recognize that this is my first one in a long time just due to life changes. So I'm happy to be back and teaching these again. And then I also precept all of the Utah dietetic students here on campus as well. And one of my favorite things to do is to present these lunch and learns. And then today we'll be talking specifically about digestive health and how to improve our gut microbiome and our digestive health overall. So moving on to the next slide. See. These are the objectives of the lunch and learn today. So we'll talk about what our gut microbiome is and why it is important for specifically our digestive health. We'll talk about what can impact our gut and our microbiome and the bacteria that live in there. We'll talk a lot about fiber, prebiotics, and probiotics today. We'll also talk a little bit about fermented foods as well. And then at the end, we'll talk about some actionable steps that we can take to optimize our digestive health. So that's kind of a roadmap of where we're going today. Specifically with the gut microbiome, and you can put this in the chat, but is there anything that you have heard related to this term or just what you think it is? So put those thoughts in the chat and then I'll share with you what it is. And if you don't know, that's okay. There's a lot to learn today as well. Someone said healthy bacteria in your gut relates to overall health for sure. Organisms in your digestive tract, that's also right. So both of those are great things to think about with the gut microbiome. So, let's see, the gut microbiome is essentially all of the organisms that are living within our digestive tract or our gut. And this can be trillions of organisms. So this can be anything from bacteria to fungi, parasites, viruses, lots of different organisms live within our gut. And specifically, when we talk about gut health, we're really talking about the large intestine because that's where a lot of our digestion happens. This is also where a lot of those organisms will live. When we're talking about the gut microbiome, it plays a super important role in a lot of different things. So these are all listed here. It has a huge role in making sure our immune system is functioning well, kind of optimizing that function of our immune system. It also keeps our gut barrier healthy so that we can fight off infections as well. So that also kind of relates to that immune system and the role that it plays. Our gut also produces what are called short chain fatty acids. So I'm going to be referencing that term a lot throughout the presentation today. And so that will be designated by SCFA. But short chain fatty acids are important for a couple of different reasons. These help to lower the pH in our gut, which allows us and our guts to break down any pathogens in our bodies. So that's super important, again, when we're talking about immune system and gut health. It also allows us to reduce inflammation in our bodies as well. And then these short chain fatty acids also allow us to increase how fast things are processed through our guts. So we call it gut motility, but this really helps, especially with preventing constipation as well. So short chain fatty acids are super important in a lot of different ways. Our gut can also make vitamin K, vitamin B12, and other B vitamins. Some of these can be really important, especially if we follow more of a plant-based diet, so either vegetarian or vegan type diets. Sometimes we miss out on a lot of these if we're eating more plant-based foods. So our gut can actually make these as well to help make sure that we're getting that balance. Um, this is a big one, but our gut obviously metabolizes or breaks down all of the food that we eat. So when we break down that food, we get energy from that food to sustain all of our body processes. So that's a huge role of what our gut plays. And then reducing inflammation as well. Okay, so when we're talking about the gut microbiome, we typically want a higher amount of what we call microbial diversity. So we want all of those organisms that are living in our gut to be very diverse. So this, when we have a higher diversity of the bacteria in our gut, that leads to better health overall. Having not as much diversity or variety in the bacteria in our gut can be linked with some chronic health conditions. This could be type 2 diabetes, this could be inflammatory bowel disease or IBS, this could be rheumatoid arthritis, heart disease, or cardiovascular disease. There's even some cancers that are being linked to low diversity of that gut microbiome. And there's also a lot of research coming out pretty recently within the last year or two on how our gut and the bacteria that live in there affect our mental health as well. So they're finding a lot of links with anxiety and depressive disorders. And if that bacteria in our gut isn't balanced or isn't healthy, that can affect a lot of mental health conditions. And that's due to what we call the gut-brain axis. We'll talk a little bit about that later, but our gut and our brain are constantly communicating. And if there is kind of that low diversity or some unbalance within our gut, that can definitely lead to more or higher risk for anxiety or depression. So just something to keep in mind as well, kind of an interesting link. So next we'll move into kind of what impacts our microbiome or what affects our microbiome. Our microbiome is affected by a lot of different things. You'll see this baby over here on the screen. Our gut and the bacteria that live there are really established starting during our infancy. So, depending on what we're fed as babies, so either breast milk or formula can impact our gut microbiome all the way through our adult years and into those later stages of life. They're also finding that the way babies are birthed can also impact their gut microbiome. So, like a C-section or just a normal delivery, that can also impact the bacteria that are found in our gut. Genetics also plays a huge role. So unfortunately, we can't choose our genetics. Maybe we don't get the best genetics sometimes. Maybe we get good genes sometimes. We can't choose that mixture. But our family history and our genetics can impact the bacteria that live in our guts. We talked about the birthing process. Infant feeding practices, again, we talked about that, is a huge one. Our environment also plays an impact in our microbiome. Our diet, and we'll talk a lot about that throughout this presentation, but that's a huge part of how our bacteria can kind of change with the foods that we're eating. Stress, we'll also talk a little bit about that later and how that can change our composition of bacteria. If we're taking antibiotics or other medications, that can also impact the bacteria in our guts. Any illnesses, and then our age as well. So when we're talking about age, there's two phases of life where we can have the most impact with altering the bacteria in our guts. So that is infancy, which we talked about already, and then the elderly. Those are the two stages of life where we can really have an impact in growing that good bacteria that we want in our guts. So just something to keep in mind as well. So, with kind of the gut microbiome and digestive health, there's a lot of limitations in areas of future research right now. This is definitely probably a hot research topic within, I would say, like the last 5 to 10 years. This has really started picking up. But we don't actually know yet what is considered a healthy microbiome. We're learning a lot right now about the different types of bacteria, what these certain types can help with regards to like health conditions. We also have, when we're talking about like improving our digestive health, a lot of times we hear like, oh, take probiotics. That's great. That's a great suggestion. But some people don't always respond to probiotics. So we have those responders versus non responders to all of the interventions that we have out there. We also don't have a ton of research on how to modify an individual's microbiome specifically. So again, we can kind of say that like blanket statement of like you can take a probiotic or increase your fiber or do all these different things, but we don't know how to specifically alter someone's gut bacteria for that specific individual. So current research there is kind of lacking on what general recommendations we should be putting out there versus just counseling people individually on these sorts of issues. And then despite all of the tests that are out there, any direct to consumer tests to see like what bacteria are in your microbiome are not super accurate right now, just given the level of evidence that we have with a lot of these bacterial strains. And again, we don't really know what that healthy microbiome is yet. We're still diving into what bacteria is good and bad and all of the things that different strains can help out with. So any testing is currently not recommended just because of the lack of research in this area. And we're still like learning new things every day. Okay, before I jump into diet and things that we can do, dietary practices to increase the amount of good bacteria in our microbiome, does anyone have any questions on what your gut microbiome is or how it's impacted? And you can just put those in the chat or you can unmute yourself as well. I'll give you just a second. If you do have questions to put those in, I'll just check the chat, but I'll kind of keep chatting unless I see a question pop up. So with diet, there is a lot, especially out on social media, out there on the internet, with how to improve like the diversity of the bacteria that are in your gut or improving that gut microbiome. Sometimes the advice that is out there isn't always accurate. So hopefully we can give you a better picture today of things that you can actually do that may help increase that good bacteria in your guts. So we'll jump into the diet part. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. So with diet, fiber is the one thing that has the greatest potential to influence the amount of good bacteria that are in our guts. And if we just want to diversify kind of those bacterial strains, fiber is going to be the way that we want to do that. There's a lot of research in this area, again, that fiber has kind of the greatest potential for us to kind of change the bacteria that are in our guts. And that's because of those short chain fatty acids that I mentioned earlier. So we talked about those helping with inflammation. We talked about those helping with getting rid of any pathogens in our bodies and also increasing how fast foods are processed through our gut as well. With that, there is no difference in microbiome composition between a vegan diet or vegetarian diet, so kind of more of those plant-based dietary patterns, compared to omnivores, which is people who eat obviously plants and animal products. We do see more, again, of those short chain fatty acids produced more in plant-based diets. And that is just because of the fiber that is found in a lot of those plant-based foods. And I did want to mention that people who are eating high protein, low carb diets, they're finding that those people significantly reduce the amount of short chain fatty acids that they produce. So we've talked a lot about the benefits of those. Not saying that protein is bad and you should not eat protein because it's great. But when we're looking at gut composition, carbs, and specifically those that are high in fiber, really help to confer all of the benefits that we're talking about. So we'll kind of jump in to like macronutrients that affect the gut. So with protein, we talked a little bit last slide about how maybe those following high protein diets see a little bit lower production of those short chain fatty acids. When we're talking about protein and how we can use that to increase the bacteria in our guts, it's worth mentioning plant proteins are superior or better compared to animal proteins when we're talking about increasing the diversity of the bacteria in our guts. Fat, specifically high fat diets, so this would be things like keto, and then saturated fat as well. Should be, this says avoided, but just kind of used sparingly. While monounsaturated fatty acids, which are found in olive oil, avocados, peanut butter, almonds, pumpkin seeds, and sesame seeds, and then omega-3s as well. So that would be like any fatty fish, so like salmon and sardines are the most common ones. Walnuts, flaxseed, sunflower seeds, and then tofu or any soy products. Any of those have more heart healthy fats in them, and those help to regulate the diversity of the bacteria in our guts, rather than saturated fats, which could be like butter or lard, or typically more of our solid fats at room temperature. Those can kind of decrease the amount of good bacteria in our guts as well. And then carbs. So we talked about fiber being the biggest thing that we can increase to help with that bacterial diversity. The type of carbohydrates we're consuming has the biggest effect on our gut microbiome. I'm just seeing a couple of questions pop up in the chat. Stephanie says, how many grams of fiber do you recommend? We'll get to that in a later slide. I have specific recommendations, but fiber can be really hard to get enough, and most of us typically don't eat enough fiber. But I'll give you specific recommendations for fiber in just a little bit. And then I will also send a list of these slides so she can share those with you as well. Fiber is, let's see, consistent. So carbs, when we're talking about carb foods, we are talking about any starches, sugars, and fiber when we say the blanket term of carbohydrate. High fiber diets, just generally, are linked to lower risk of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, any diverticular disease, and then also they're finding a lot of benefit with risk of reducing breast cancer. So that's also interesting. Fiber is found in a variety of different food sources, and a lot of times it is our plant-based foods. So this includes any fruits, vegetables, legumes, whole grains, oats, barley, nuts, and seeds. So with legumes, if you're not familiar with that term, that includes beans, soybeans, chickpeas, edamame, and lentils. So that would be considered foods that are in that legume family. And then when we're talking about fiber, there's also two different types of fiber. So there's insoluble fibers, which when you eat those, they actually don't get broken down in our digestive tract. So they kind of stay in that whole form. These are super helpful in adding like bulk to our stools, which can help ease constipation and help things move through more easily. On the flip side of that, there is soluble fiber. When we eat these foods, these are kind of fermented and broken down by the bacteria in our guts, and they form like a gel consistency in our GI tract, which helps again to kind of pull all of the stool through our bodies. And I have people ask me, like, do I need a certain amount of insoluble versus soluble fiber? You don't need to necessarily worry about which type you're eating. A lot of times, the foods with fiber have a good mixture of like both insoluble and soluble fiber. So these sources mentioned here as fiber sources are likely going to have a combination of both. So you don't need to worry about getting a certain percentage of insoluble versus a certain percentage of soluble fiber. We really just want to make sure that we're eating fibrous foods. One thing with soluble fiber, this one specifically helps to decrease cholesterol. So if any of you on this Zoom meeting have high cholesterol, specifically soluble fiber can help us naturally decrease cholesterol. And the goal overall is really just to increase our fiber intake generally. So again, we'll kind of talk about specific ways to do that in just a little bit, but you don't necessarily need to worry again about types of fiber. We just want to make sure that we're generally consuming enough fiber in our diets. So the next thing with carbohydrates that impacts our gut bacteria are what we call non-digestible carbs or resistant starches. So these are typically living in our large intestine. So when we eat these types of starches, they don't get broken down in the upper parts of our GI tract. They typically make it down a little bit lower into that large intestine. They specifically help with increasing feelings of fullness, again, decreasing cholesterol, and these ones also have specific risks for lowering that colon cancer. Resistant starches are found in plantains, green bananas, beans, peas, lentils, any whole grains, and then cooked and cooled rice and potatoes. So if, say we're meal prepping, we make a bunch of rice, a bunch of potatoes, it's still going to have a little bit of resistant starch the day that we cook it. But as we let rice and potatoes sit in the fridge, as they cool longer and longer over the days, they'll have a higher content of these resistant starches. So that's just kind of a fun fact. These resistant starches are kind of similar to prebiotics, which we'll talk about in the next slide, but they are kind of that food that's available for our gut bacteria and provides kind of that energy for our gut bacteria to kind of grow and diversify. So they're really important in that we just get a good amount of resistant starches in our diets. Again, so they help with increasing the soluble fiber a lot of times. They are available to our gut bacteria for energy. And then with that energy, our gut bacteria can produce those short chain fatty acids, which keep popping up, which help again to like lower inflammation, help increase the time that things pass through our digestive system. And then they also help break down those pathogens in our bodies. So resistant starches are great for a lot of different things. Okay, so prebiotics is another term that I feel like we hear a lot of times when we're talking about gut microbiome and increasing that diversity. So this is a big, huge, scary definition. This is essentially a prebiotic is just food for the bacteria in our gut. So you can look at this big, scary definition, but prebiotics are really just feeding that good gut bacteria, giving that bacteria the energy that it needs to, again, produce those short chain fatty acids, produce that energy to kind of grow and diversify our guts. I'm just looking at a question really quick. If cooked and cooled rice and potatoes are reheated, they are still rich in resistant carbs. Yes, that is correct. So back to prebiotics. Only a certain subset of fiber that we have in our diet acts as prebiotics. So we'll go over food sources for those. But like I said, these prebiotics really provide the nutrients and the energy for our gut bacteria to produce those short chain fatty acids. So they're the food for that bacteria in our guts. You typically don't need to buy any sort of prebiotic supplement. A lot of times, if we're eating those fibrous foods, so those fruits, vegetables, beans, whole grains, things that we've already mentioned, you don't need to add supplementation specifically on top of that. If your diet is limited or you're a picky eater, it could be helpful to add a prebiotic supplement, and we'll talk about supplementation in just a little bit, but typically we don't need supplements for prebiotics. Some specific food groups that are high in prebiotics are oatmeal, asparagus, onions, garlic, wheat, barley, apples, bananas, peas, and beans. So you'll see a lot of these same foods popping up throughout. So it's a great way, like a lot of these foods like oatmeal and wheat and vegetables and fruits, if we're just eating these foods like we should be, we don't necessarily need to worry about all of the prebiotics and the fiber and soluble versus insoluble. We're just going to typically be getting enough if we're having that varied diet. So that's just something to keep in mind. Also, with like prebiotic supplements, the response that people see with these is highly individualized. So sometimes if someone adds in a prebiotic supplement, that may or may not necessarily increase that gut bacteria, that good gut bacteria that we're aiming for. So really with supplements, it may or may not work for you. And there's really no way to tell specifically if it's working with regards to like that bacterial diversity, just because again we can't really test that yet, but it could, if you notice like lower amount of GI symptoms, that could be something beneficial if you were taking a supplement, something that you would want to pay attention to. So that highly individualized response. Okay, so with probiotics, I feel like this is something that a lot of people typically have heard more about. Probiotics is, I feel like, a hot nutrition topic right now. There's kind of a lot of buzz around this word. So, probiotics essentially are just those live microorganisms or bacteria that are living within our guts that will give us that health benefit that we're looking for. So, decreasing risk of all of those chronic diseases that we mentioned, reducing inflammation, kind of all of those benefits of having that diverse gut microbiome. So with probiotics, they are strain specific with regards to benefit. So if you are picking just a random probiotic off the shelf of like a drugstore or a health supplement store, that's great. But generally, when we're looking at specific strains, those are going to have specific benefits. So if we're having, say we just did a course of like antibiotics, we're now having diarrhea associated with those antibiotics, there's going to be a certain strain of probiotic that's going to help that. Again, a certain strain of probiotic that's going to help with constipation. Kind of some of these other like IBS symptoms or GI symptoms. There's specific strains that will help with all of these conditions. Again, we're researching all of the strain specific benefits right now, but if you're just going into a store hoping to buy a probiotic and have it solve all of your issues, that's more than likely not going to work just because of those specific benefits coming from different bacteria. And I'll show you guys a website, and I'll also put it in the chat in just a second, where you can kind of see some of these strain specific benefits as well. Probiotics are considered supplements. So when we're talking about the supplement industry, probiotics are regulated just like any other health supplement, which essentially means there's no regulation. which is kind of scary. So, unfortunately, there's very relaxed oversight when it comes to a lot of supplements that are put out there. And a lot of times, what's listed in a product could or could not be what you actually purchased. So that's kind of the scary part with supplements is it's really just kind of a game that you play. So with regards to supplements, I'm just gonna pause this for just a second and pull up this website for you all to see. Please let me know if you cannot see my screen. But this is a really helpful website for just kind of giving you basic information about the probiotic products that are available right now. So I'll go ahead and put this link in the chat. Someone says they do not see the website. So let me change my share. Give me just a second. Okay, you should be able to see it now. So when you visit this website, there's like different categories across the top. We'll just go into adult health today just to kind of show you what this website looks like. This looks like a lot, but over here on the side is like common brand names of certain or specific supplements. So you can see like Align Probiotics. I feel like that's one that at least I hear about a lot, but you can scroll down and there's a bunch of like brand name supplements. So if you're taking a probiotic right now, you could look for your specific brand that you're taking. This website will also tell you what strains are in that probiotic specifically. And then it also has like dosage, whether it's like a capsule or a liquid, the amount of colony forming units. So that's how we measure the amount of bacteria that are in a probiotic. So typically, the higher that number, the more bacteria are going to be in that specific probiotic. And then it will also give you dosing over on the far right. But this middle section, so this level of recommendation section, is where you're going to find the specific benefits that this probiotic would provide. So for like the first one at the top, Activia, there's level 1 evidence, so that's what this little one means over here, that this product would help with constipation and irritable bowel syndrome. So when we're looking at these charts, level 1 is like the highest amount of evidence. Sometimes there will be like 2s or 3s. That means just that we don't have maybe enough evidence to grade that as a level 1, or maybe the evidence is lacking. But if there is a 1 by this, you can be pretty confident that that specific probiotic will help with these specific conditions. So you're wanting to look for that level 1 recommendation. So if any of you are taking probiotics, I highly encourage you to just scroll through here and see if some of the benefits listed are what you're trying to prevent or help with certain probiotics. If you are like, I struggle with constipation, you could also look through this list and see different products that could be helpful with those strain specific benefits. So I'll just stop sharing my screen again and flip back to the PowerPoint. So I did put that link in the chat. So if you guys are interested, that website is a great resource to go to because it does provide that scientific information. Okay. Moving on from probiotics. So we kind of talked about what to look for with that specific website that I showed you. So you'll want to look for the specific strain and also any health conditions that you're trying to improve with certain probiotics. You'll want to look at the storage instructions as well. Sometimes these can stay in like your medicine cabinet or a kitchen cupboard, but sometimes they do need to be refrigerated just to help keep those bacteria in the product alive. So if something is supposed to be refrigerated and we just put it in our cupboard, that kills all of the bacteria in that product, and then it kind of renders it essentially useless. You wouldn't be getting any benefit from that product because all of those live bacteria have been killed off. So make sure that you are aware of storage instructions. And then with like testing, we kind of talked about that supplements are unregulated. There's not a lot of oversight. It is a good sign if the probiotic that you're taking has an independent third party testing. Still, a lot of times this can be like a USP verification. So it will have like a little, almost like sticker or badge looking image on the product, and it will say like USP verified, something to that degree. So that's a good sign that it has that third party testing, because then typically those third party testing companies will make sure that what that supplement is claiming actually has, like specifically with probiotics, the amount of bacteria that they state is going to be in that product. With probiotics, there's a lot of questions about use in those that are immunocompromised, just because these are live microorganisms that we're putting in our body. So especially if someone is going through like cancer treatment or any sort of medical treatment where your immune system is lower, that's something that we would want to consider with probiotics, and that might not be the most beneficial route to go. There are certain foods that have probiotics in there. We'll talk about those in just a second, but specifically yogurt is probably the easiest one to add to our diets where we can get a lot of probiotics naturally. And yogurt can also help improve digestion among those that are lactose intolerant. So you wouldn't maybe sometimes think of having yogurt if you can't handle like milk and dairy products, but having the probiotics in yogurt can kind of help us break down that lactose that's found in a lot of those products. So that's something that is super interesting as well. With regards to fermented foods, this is a lot of times where we find those natural probiotics. So these are again in yogurt and then any fermented food products. So kefir, sauerkraut, kombucha, miso, those are the most common types of fermented foods where we can pull those natural probiotics. Again, yogurt is the easiest, most common one out of that list, but feel free to incorporate any of those. A lot of times with these fermented foods, they don't meet the definition of a probiotic, because there's no way to quantify like what bacterial strains are in these products, but they are a good way to get some sort of natural probiotic. We couldn't necessarily tell you the strain that's in these, but a great way to just generally increase the amount of probiotics in your diet if you're not taking a supplement. Depending on the preparation process, though, of these foods, if they're using high heat or pasteurization with these foods, that can decrease or kill a lot of the bacteria that's in there. So just something to consider. It's unclear with like the heating and pasteurization process how much bacteria we're actually getting from these products. They do tend to be more easily digested though in our bodies just because of that fermentation process. So one specific example of this that I'll share with you is like wheat bread versus sourdough bread. Sourdough bread, even though it's not on this list, could be considered a fermented food that has a source of probiotics because of the fermentation process that we go through when making sourdough. So when we're looking sometimes at like if someone has like a gluten intolerance, they can digest sourdough bread a lot easier than maybe typically just like your regular whole wheat bread because of that fermentation process and that bacteria in the sourdough bread. So that's an interesting fact with kind of digestion of these fermented foods is it really helps to increase the digestion that we get. And they also contain a lot of beneficial fiber and just other chemicals, vitamins, and minerals that are beneficial for our gut bacteria and overall gut health. So increasing the amount of fermented foods that we consume in our diets can be a really helpful place to again get those natural probiotics, but also some good like beneficial fiber, and then they can help with digestion as well. Okay, there are generally some lifestyle factors that can affect our digestion as well. So we talked about stress at the beginning, and stress is a huge one. So we talked about that kind of gut-brain axis and how our gut and our brain are constantly communicating with each other. This is a lot of times too, kind of if we're feeling like stressed or if we feel nervous, we can sometimes feel it in like our gut or our stomach. So which is just kind of goes to show us how constantly our gut and our brain are communicating. So if we're stressed, either acute stress or just chronically stressed, that can cause like GI distress. It can cause a lot of stomach upset, and that can slow or delay digestion. So, something to keep in mind, we want to lower our stress levels if at all possible. I know that's easier said than done. Hydration is also super important when we're talking about digestion. If we're not consuming enough liquid in general, that doesn't allow food to move through our bodies and our digestive tract, which can lead to constipation and overall just not good functioning of our GI tract. So we want to make sure that we're specifically drinking lots of water and staying hydrated, but really just consuming a lot of liquid in general. We also want to make sure that we're not eating quickly and that we're chewing food well. I know a lot of us get, stuck on lunchtime meetings and we're just trying to like scarf down our food and hurry and eat it before we're on to the next task or meeting or thing that we have to do in our day. If we're eating super quickly, that doesn't give our bodies a great chance to digest food very well. It can also lead to a lot of bloating, it can lead to a lot of gas and just general like cramping or abdominal discomfort. So we want to make sure that we're chewing the foods that we're eating well. We're taking that time when we're eating to slow down. That can help our bodies more easily and effectively digest the foods that we're eating. So just trying to spend a little bit more time in our day eating food rather than trying to scarf it down in like 5 minutes can be super beneficial. Also, lack of movement. So, moving our bodies, participating in any sort of movement that you enjoy. So, this could definitely be our traditional forms of movement. So, like going to the gym or running, things like that. But any sort of movement will help things process more effectively through our GI tract. So if we have that slower transit time, so things are taking a lot longer to move through, that can cause constipation, which is not fun for anyone. And then it can also decrease, again, the amount of short chain fatty acids that we produce, which we talked a lot about that, really help with diversifying our gut bacteria and giving us a lot of health benefits. We also have talked about fiber as well. That can be something, lifestyle factors more related to diet that can affect digestion as well. Before I jump into the last part on how to optimize digestive health, please, if you have any questions at this point, put them in the chat and I'll just check that as I'm scrolling through these next couple slides. But these are kind of the actionable steps that we can take to really optimize or improve our digestive health. So we have talked so much about fiber, and I think it was Stephanie that had the question about how much fiber we should be eating. So the government guidelines for a dietary reference intake for fiber is about 25 to 38 grams of fiber per day. Women are going to be on that lower end, so closer to 25. Men are going to be on that higher end, so closer to 38 grams of fiber per day. Most adults only consume about 15 grams of fiber per day. The last statistic when I looked, I think it was 74% of like Americans, don't eat the recommended amount of fiber. So 3/4 of us could do a lot better in increasing our fiber intake. With increasing fiber intake, you want to do this slowly. If you increase your fiber intake too fast and add too much at one time, you're going to see a lot of cramping, a lot of bloating. You're going to be pretty uncomfortable just because our bodies going from having maybe little fiber to maybe not very much fiber to having a lot, it can be a lot for our bodies to digest and process. So just adding like one serving a day of fiber, like waiting a couple days and then maybe adding another serving, not going from like very little intake to meeting like 38 grams of fiber the very next day. That's going to definitely help reduce that GI discomfort. So gradually build up. Also, if you increase your fiber intake, you'll want to increase your water intake as well. If we're eating lots of fiber and not staying hydrated, that's just going to kind of bulk up in our GI tract and can cause too much constipation. We need that water to help things keep moving through. So, with fiber sources, we really just want to focus on variety. So again, we've talked a lot about different fiber sources. That can be any fruits, any vegetables, any whole grains, any beans, peas, any legumes. So we talked about that family being beans, chickpeas, soybeans, edamame, and lentils. Any of those, but any whole grain source of carbohydrate is going to have a good amount of fiber in there as well. So just increasing those fiber foods and really, again, kind of focusing on that variety. Sometimes fiber can be hard, especially with picky eaters. If people don't like fruits and vegetables or they don't prefer whole grains. I know sometimes like I get a lot of clients that are like, I hate beans. I don't want to even eat those. Maybe we're not familiar with like lentils or edamame or how to incorporate those. So these are just some very basic switches that I came up with to help increase the amount of fiber in your diet. So if you have like cereal in the morning for breakfast, see if we can swap that out with like oatmeal. Even adding some more plant-based foods with breakfast. So if we're doing like oatmeal, adding berries in there, adding a banana in there, an apple. If you're doing like scrambled eggs or like omelets, see if we can add like spinach or peppers or mushrooms or some other vegetable in there to get a little bit more fiber. Smoothies, this isn't on here. Those are also a really great way to add like yogurt, which we talked about being high in probiotics. We can get a lot of fruits and vegetables in smoothies as well. So if you have those picky eaters, smoothies can be really great to like disguise the taste. And maybe sometimes it's like a texture issue with lots of fruits and vegetables. So that would be another really easy way to kind of get a lot of those fibrous foods in. Also doing like meatless meals can be really helpful. We talked about not necessarily having to go like vegetarian or vegan, but just incorporating more of those plant-based foods. So if we're doing like a chili or a soup, maybe we add like beans or lentils to that soup instead of meat. So like a vegetarian chili or any like soup or dish that you're making, maybe we can swap out that source of protein with a more plant-based protein. So if you don't want to do like beans or lentils, that could also be like any tofu or soy products are great sources of plant-based protein. Also, any nuts and seeds are going to be a great source of plant-based protein as well. With our meals, adding like a side salad or cooked vegetables to the meals that we're eating. With snacking, maybe swapping like chips or cookies for like carrots and hummus, or like a fruit with a nut butter. And then really just eating more whole types of foods or as much like unprocessed food as we can. Again, I know we all have busy lives and we may not always be able to incorporate whole foods all the time, but if there can be those spots in your day where you plan out to have more of those whole foods, that can be really beneficial in upping that fiber intake. And then, so these are just some other actionable steps that you can take. This is just kind of a wrap up of all of the things that we've talked about today, but just increasing the plant foods in your diet. I think I've said this way too many times, but really increasing the amount of foods listed below in our diets can be super beneficial for getting the fiber, for getting those resistant starches, for getting those probiotics, and other things that really help to grow the amount of good bacteria in our guts. Plant-based does not necessarily mean vegan or vegetarian. Um, the most helpful dietary pattern that I can tell you guys to look at that helps with kind of more of this plant-based concept is the Mediterranean diet. So I don't have anything specifically linked here, but if you just get on Google and look at like Mediterranean diet, it will give you a lot of great information on what's included in that diet, but really they're just emphasizing more of the whole grains, more plant-based foods, just using meat and other animal protein sources more sparingly, just to help again increase that fiber, increase the prebiotics and good bacteria in our guts as well. We can also work on ways to reduce stress that can help with overall digestive health. Meditation can be also a really good tool to help reduce stress. Mindful eating, so that kind of relates back to like slowing down at meals, making sure we're chewing things well, just really paying attention to like our hunger and fullness cues, things like that, making sure we're not overeating. That can help with digestion, slowing down and chewing food more when we're eating rather than just trying to scarf it down super fast. Any sort of movement is going to be helpful as well. Hydration, and this is super individual, but typically we want at least 64 ounces of water per day. And then anything we get on top of that that's extra is great. If you are more physically active, you could need more with regards to hydration, but that blanket 64 ounces is kind of like a good general recommendation for most people. So that would equal about 8 cups of water. And then really working with either your physician or a dietitian on supplementation. Sometimes, like I said, probiotics can be helpful if there's a certain thing that you're wanting a benefit for, like if you do struggle with constipation or a certain like GI symptom, probiotics can be really helpful if it's indicated. And working with a medical professional to kind of help you determine that can be a great starting point rather than, again, just kind of pulling a probiotic off the shelf and hoping that it will work for you. So these are just some actionable steps to take. These are all of my references if any of you guys want to look at those. And then my contact information is on this slide, my email. And then I do, like I said at the beginning, meet with people one-on-one and do individual consultations. So if this is something that you're interested in, talking more about this topic or anything else related to diet and nutrition, I would love to meet with you. And you can schedule at the Calendly link attached to this slide. And we can talk about specific things that you can do to maybe improve digestive health, or if there's anything else that you have questions on. I always love to meet with people individually because it can be helpful to get specific recommendations rather than just general ones. So that's all I have for you today. I will just kind of check the chat for any questions, or you guys can unmute yourselves. But if you don't have anything, for me, thank you for joining, and it was fun to talk to you more about this topic.